Lieder sind Brüder der Revolution, Lieder sind ihre Begleiter.
I'm Hannah Judd.
I'm Sydney Hutchinson.
This is Playing the Archive, a podcast of Second World music. Welcome to Playing the Archive. I'm Sydney Hutchinson, and I'm here with Hannah Judd, a visiting researcher here in Berlin at the Humboldt Forum and Ethnological Museum. Hannah, thanks for joining me. Let's begin with some background. We've been working together here in Berlin for a couple of years, but what brought you to Berlin originally, and why did the Humboldt Forum feel like the right place to carry out your research?
Thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here. Part of why I came to Berlin was a piece of grad student wisdom passed down to me, which is if you can write your project anywhere, you should pick somewhere that you want to go. So I had visited Berlin, I think, for the first time in 2017, and it was just a city I really liked. I really liked the musical scene. I had a couple of friends who had moved here after college, or a couple of jazz musician friends who had gotten priced out of New York. And I felt like that was a really interesting place. The opportunity to have a project that dovetailed with that came up kind of organically. So in 2019, I was a summer fellow, and then I started working in the regular accessions of the special collections of the University of Chicago at the Regenstein Library. And the project I was working on then was actually, it was an alum of the university who had collected all of these jazz posters. He had mostly bought them, but also found them in the neighborhoods, took them off telephone poles and things. So it was Chicago area primarily, but also this sort of eBay collection of all these jazz posters. I had worked in some other archives before, but it was this chance to do accessioning. After I moved into the sort of general accessioning of special collections, a lot of what I was working with were the archives of professors at the university. They'll solicit some donations from some fancy alums, but a lot of the work they do is just sort of internal documentation of university processes. So what happens to professors who retire or who choose to start dealing with their archives ahead of retirement, which is advisable. It was taking those things on, putting them in the catalog, dealing with the restricted information and what could become available to researchers right away. And in the course of doing that, something that I learned was that the university wasn't set up very well to deal with digital materials, period, and with sound materials really at all. And that's something that's changing, but COVID made it more of a problem because there was this real backlog of accessions. There was a real shortage of people, and there was a sort of inconsistency between staff. Somebody didn't finish and they didn't leave the protocol for how to take over with what they were doing. This was a real problem there. And so my advisor, Phil Bullman, had a fieldwork archive, and it was primarily cassette tapes, and it needed to get dealt with. And I happened to be on the inside. I knew that to them, dealing with it would be giving everything a number and putting it on a shelf. It wouldn't be an opportunity to digitize the material. It wouldn't really be available to other people in the near future, and they didn't really have the equipment, the technology, or the manpower to change that anytime soon. And Phil had a longer relationship with this institution already. He worked a lot with Lars Koch, doing instrument collection, doing fieldwork collection, and he was a student of Bruno Nettel, who was a student of George Herzog, who worked with Hornbostel.
Yeah, cool. There's a couple of things in there that might require further explanation for listeners who are not ethnomusicologists like us. The Berlin Phonogram Archive, or Phonogram Archiv, is, some would say, the earliest sound archive in the world, although some people in Vienna like to dispute that distinction. And it's located here at the Ethnological Museum. And Hornbostel, who you mentioned, is one of its earliest directors, Erich von Hornbostel.
Also, some of his research was dealing with the wax cylinder collections of the Phonogram Archiv, and his cabaret ensemble also had done performances that then were included in recordings. So all of this meant that there were these pre-established reasons that his fieldwork might have a home in both of these places. And taking the tapes here and digitizing them here meant that the university could have the digital copies, which is a superior alternative to the university having tapes that they didn't take care of or allow people really to interact with. So that was the initial project that drew me here, and I got temporary funding for that from the University of Chicago, and then I got more funding to finish up the digitizing at the Ethnological Museum and at the Humboldt Forum. On my dissertation writing, the research question is about museums and access and how specifically sound archives are positioned in a unique way that we might be able to allow access more. But there are questions of logistics and ethics and copyright that you don't encounter with other materials in quite the same way. It becomes a little bit of a puzzle and a fun thing to play with.
Yeah, so there's many layers of connections between what you're doing and the history of this place. Now we have, of course, the Ethnological Museum being located on Museum Island in central Berlin just for the last couple of years as part of the Humboldt Forum. And the Humboldt Forum foregrounds the idea that it's a place for the meeting of cultures and peoples. And it was just in the process of opening when you arrived here to begin your work. What has the space offered that shaped the way you approached your project, or how does your work fit into its mission?
So something that's really important and really interesting and really inspiring about the Humboldt Forum is they have this sort of attitude that's like, we do things a little differently around here. We're not like a regular museum. We're a cool museum. I don't know how much of that carries into my work. I mean, I'm interested in things like decolonizing or things like the way they're trying to take museum studies approaches to questions of provenance and returning. A lot of the reason I wanted to be there was just the technology question. They have an audio lab that is really, really well equipped with all of these machines to digitize all of these different formats. They had workflow set up so you could digitize all of these different formats, something that was very appealing coming from a place that didn't have. And also it was very cool to see the way that they dealt with stuff like returning the Benin bronzes. Something nice about the way the Ethnological Museum has been operating for a long time is that they can digitize the sounds and they can then give copies of the music to source communities. And that work is something I wanted to learn more about, where it's not really an object, it's the contents that are meaningful to people. And so you can make these copies and you can return those things. And that is really cool to be able to do.
Yeah, most people, you send them a wax cylinder and they're going to be like, great, what do I do with this?
Like, I can't play it. It's hard to store. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And even for more recent media like reel-to-reel tapes or cassettes, it's still something that most people don't have in their home anymore.
Yeah, and you need specialty equipment that can break. And when it breaks, you need to usually buy a used piece of equipment to just get the replacement part. There aren't really technicians. They're not really making new parts. It's finicky. And so it's a nice way to operate, to have the sort of technology that you need here and then work on getting the thing that's important to the people who are looking for it.
Yeah. You mentioned you've been spending a lot of time on the fieldwork tapes of Phil Bowman, and he's, of course, a well-known ethnomusicologist at University of Chicago who's written about Jewish music, the history of the field, Eurovision, and so many other topics. Could you tell us some more about these recordings, what's on them, why they're significant, or why they belong in an archive like this?
Yes. So it's, I think, important to note that this space has always housed the sort of archives of the professors who were involved in it. So Phil's fieldwork, the oldest thing was from his master's thesis on southwestern Wisconsin, and it's a reel-to-reel tape of a farmer singing in 1977. Most recent thing in the tape collection was from like 2001 or 2002. And then there were some CDs also from around that time. It really moves through every type of medium, mini tapes and cassette tapes and CDs. So it's, I think, important to note that this space has always housed the sort of archives of the professors who were involved in it. And that's something that a lot of stuff has moved to the Humboldt Forum. This space in Dahlem in particular is a space where a lot of that material is available and is out on the shelves and accessible in a way that it hasn't always been.
Just breaking in here to explain that Dahlem is a leafy green neighborhood on the outskirts of Berlin, where the Ethnological Museum and Museum for Asian Art used to be located. Today they're open to the public in the Humboldt Forum on the Museum Island in the middle of town. But the old museums have now turned into a research campus, and in fact that's still where we do a lot of research and practice East German dances and dance music as you are hearing now. And now back to Hannah.
So this is a space where the history of ethnomusicology is a story that it tells a little bit, I think, and the different people who were really involved in being the collectors and organizers of that work have their materials. There are also the contributions that other people have done, donating their field work of different places to the archive. These collections have a very broad span in terms of both the sort of research questions and the actual geographic locations. The oldest ones start in Wisconsin with a lot of German-speaking immigrants and collecting the sort of folk songs that they're singing and the American context. And then things move to Israel and, again, talking to a lot of immigrants who were foundational in sort of dictating the ways that Israeli musicology formed itself as a discipline and operated, people like Edith Gershon-Kiwi. Then there are collections from research on pilgrimage, and these are kind of interesting because they're commercial tapes, but they're not tapes that are available along the pilgrimage route. You can purchase this thing, but it's not broadly available. So there's a lot of significant material in terms of the sort of history of the discipline question. Musicologists and ethnomusicologists who were doing the work of shaping how collections and archives and world music and the intellectual community globally was operating in late 20th century. And then commercial recordings that deal with a lot of different genre questions that are interesting as well.
Cool. While you were listening to these tapes and digitizing them, was there anything surprising or unexpected that you heard on them?
I never really knew what to expect. And a lot of things were very well organized. Like I said, there were these categories like music from Romania, klezmer music, Jewish music, music in Germany. But sometimes something in them would be not quite that. So the particular one I remember is there was a tape that was a classroom tape. So it was like a Music 102 exam or something. So it had like a bit of Wozzeck and then Liza Minnelli singing cabaret. And it's interesting. We do have out in the other room some of these boxes of like Dieter Christensen's that are like Standards 1 exam, pro-sem notes. That's kind of the same thing as that tape, the process of teaching these things or arranging these things being also a question in the midst of this fieldwork collection.
Yeah, that's interesting. In this archive, we do have so many things like lecture notes and exams going back for so many decades of disciplinary history. It would be kind of funny to compare them, and the idea that the exams that we give will one day be in an archive is a little bit horrifying. Let's talk a little bit more about digitizing. It seems like it would be a pretty simple affair. Press play and then press record and you're done. But in actuality, you have to make decisions along the way in terms of balancing the need for technical fidelity with honoring the cultural, historical significance of those sounds. I wonder if you could talk us a little bit more through that process of digitizing and decision-making and how you approach these questions.
Well, first, I'll just say it's more like press record, press play, tape error, start over, press record, plus press play. Oh, it paused for I don't know why. It takes twice as much time as the length of the tape to get the recording done when you build in technical failure or some sand in the gear. And yeah, there is the question of fidelity versus meaning. So something I find interesting is the music isn't always the most important thing on the tape to me. A lot of the time, the more interesting thing is like, oh, there's an interruption and Phil is actually saying something about like, no, could you do it this way? Or how about this? Or the performer on the tape is like, oh, like you don't want to hear that, or is laughing or makes a mistake.
He wouldn't keep still. He just talk all the time.
Well, he's dead, though, right? You're supposed to
He's
be
supposed to be dead, but he wouldn't mind. He wouldn't keep quiet. Well,
The kind of beginning and end and parts that you would cut for the recording are the things that tell us more, because what we're always looking for is this context around who is doing it and why are they doing it and what's their attitude towards the music they're making. And then there's the fidelity question, which is to say you want the scratches too. If you are being archival about it, you don't want to erase the damage the tape has done. You want to treat that as a layer to which you're listening. There are sound engineer guys who I think that really bugs. Yeah, good advice I got early on from Karozus, who's no longer here, but who was a technician here. I wasn't recording a side because it was blank. That's like a monumental amount of storage space on static. And she went, no, because it's the fidelity of the object. What you want to record is this tape, which includes this blank side. When people are accessing the digital thing, they're probably not going to listen to the blank tape, but you want the record, not just a half of a tape and a note.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's true that maybe what people think we're doing in this kind of research is quite different from what we actually end up doing. People tend to think, okay, ethnomusicologists, you're playing music and listening to music all the time, when in actuality, in my research, there's a lot of times where I'm fast forwarding through the music and listening to the stage announcements over and over.
Yeah, the joke I heard is can't have ethnomusicology without no music in the middle, right at the heart. And I don't think that's true, but I do think at times there's something about music that becomes very slippery and hard to write about, and context can be an easier point of approach. Context is a helpful thing anyway to have, so it's not a bad approach to take to be like, what are the circumstances surrounding this if I can't actually get to the thing itself?
That's true. But we do still play music.
We do, but we're not like most ethnomusicologists. We're different. No, I don't think that. But I think also that was something that appealed to me about being here, and it's part of why I kind of stuck around after the official part of my research was over and lingered in the halls, is that the possibility here of things opening up was really interesting to me. And some of that, I think, was facilitated by the Humboldt Forum being this new and official and fancy space, was that this space hasn't been forgotten about, but there are now these open spaces and new things that we can do there, like making music and dance, just because we have the kind of room to play around.
One of the topics that you're interested in is accessibility, which of course a lot of us are also interested in ethnomusicology. But there's also some difficulties and problems that come up when you're trying to make things accessible digitally, including ethical dimensions, particularly regarding indigenous cultures or community recordings. How do you approach these ethical considerations?
It's so hard because coming in, I had this extremely American perspective on the access question, where I understood the problem as being simple. And because if you're working in the sort of American academy, you can use pretty much anything under the fair use guidelines. Not anything, but you can use a lot of material, especially with older recordings. They are fair game. They're not under copyright protections. The question where this gets hairy in America is indigenous recordings, and that is because modern day communities have come forward and said, actually, these were recorded under circumstances where we don't think that they should be shared, and we think they should be private. As an archivist, you're working sometimes with sensitive material. So you just label that as sensitive material. You put the sticker on it that says don't listen for 50 years or 100 years, or only these people can listen. And that's okay. And you move on. But the German copyright laws are so much more restrictive and so different. The European data protection laws are so intense, and I don't think they're a bad thing necessarily, but they do make it hard to share stuff. I don't have a good answer. It just is something where I didn't realize ahead of time. And then I got here and I was like, oh, this is so much more complicated. And the way a lot of people end up operating is in this sort of gray area of, if you know enough to ask, then I guess you can have the files, but you shouldn't technically have them, and you can't publish them. You can just listen to them and write about them.
Yeah. Oh, it's super complicated and makes me think of a friend I have back home in Tucson, Arizona, who's Tohono O'odham, which is an Indian tribe that's historically in the southern part of Arizona and northern Mexico. And he's been brought in a number of times to deal with archival recordings of Tohono O'odham songs and advise on how they should make these accessible, or if they should, and what they should do with these recordings. And then one time he turned on the recording and he found himself listening to a song that he should never have heard and no one should ever hear, because it's something that can make you sick if you hear it and you're Tohono O'odham. And then he's like, crap, what am I listening to? Turn it off. And then what do you do with a tape like that?
Yeah, you just put like a skull picture on the outside. Do not open.
No,
Danger,
do not
danger.
play.
And this is a more theoretical example of a literal problem that we also encounter here, which is sometimes the materials that we touch are poisonous or covered in toxic dust, and
there are all kinds
pesticide.
being made sick by recordings. So that goes to say that sound archives are really interesting places to work and to do research, but I don't know how much your average Joe or Jane knows about them. And in fact, when I think about sound archives and what I would think about them when I was a kid, I think of one of my favorite books, which is The Phantom Tollbooth. I don't know if you know this book, but there's a part in it where there's Dr. Discord and the Awful Din, who's kind of like a genie that helps him out. And they live in a caravan and they travel around collecting awful sounds in jars. And their shelves are lined with jars full of horrible sounds. And this makes me think maybe people think of sound archives like this.
Yeah, Mila going, why would anybody do that?
Exactly.
Why would anybody want to do this?
So maybe you could talk about how sound archives differ from other kinds of archives that you know, and what kind of special challenges or opportunities arise in working with sound.
Actually, the first archive work that I ever did was entirely digital archive called Pen Sound, which is a repository of poetry. The work that I did there was they had these whole readings that they gathered, and I was in charge of taking the individual poems out and putting them online as single files. So if you wanted, John Ashbery reads Dream Song 3, you can go play just that. It was a lot of fun to do. You get to listen to a lot of poetry. And it was also interesting because it's this totally digital archive that was totally based on these ideas of getting access to everybody.
15 hour less close to feeling bad and restless. Spent fast food and drink while you've been sleeping.
That
Now really
is a very
writing.
different sound archive than the one here, where a lot of the material is this analog material. So if you want to listen to it, you have to go seek it out and then figure out if the file's already been digitized or not. And then if it's not, you have to go through the process of putting yourself in line and getting the digitized file later, or jumping through the catalog and finding what is already available.
Do you think sound archives offer something other media can't in terms of connecting people to history and culture?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's something really beautiful and spooky and profound about hearing voices from the past that is different than seeing even the writing of someone, or, holding something that they had back then, where it's like you're really hearing them. They're trying to talk to you on some level. It's a somewhat obscure level. If you're listening to a wax cylinder, they're trying to talk to you and they're like on a horse that's really loud. But it's still this kind of, it does feel really personal in a way that other things don't. And I think there is something personal also about archives in general. There's this kind of question of, to be very annoying and Derridian about it, archives being a space where the very personal and private becomes public, and there's a sort of diary or internalness to these collections. Sound, I think, even more so than in other forms. And something a professor of mine, Lauren Berlant, said once that I think about literally all the time is just when you're dead, everything is a remain, including you. Archives are the remains, it's the traces, it's the leftovers, it's the thing that's happening after the fact, and it's what we're working with to try and reconstitute that past.
There's a reason they're called memory institutions. But your research also touches on the idea of viral sounds. Could you explain what that means and how it ties into your broader work?
Yeah, so this is also where I sort of linked digitizing as being the common force. I have done some research on the ways that sounds go viral now. Early internet, early memes, a lot of this stuff is totally text-based. I mean, there's an audio-visual component that happens when you start to get videos, right? The Star Wars kid as a meme, something like this. But virals happen a little bit later, and it's when people have the opportunity to sort of grasp the memed object and modify it themselves in some way and then send it back out to make this new channel of growth. And there's something happening now with TikTok where sounds get indexed in an interesting way so that you can actually see the source and the replication and the way they're moving. But that was also happening a little bit before that on platforms like Vine or Twitter or YouTube or Facebook even, where sound is a really secondary component, but there were these viral sounds, and I got really interested in how that was happening and why that was happening. And Paula Harper has a term, viral musicking, that I think is really interesting for this, the way that people participate in these sounds and spread them outwards, and they become sort of both habituated and layered with these extra meanings on top as they move.
I wonder how this relates to archives, though, because one thing that is really difficult in terms of social media and memes are that they are not getting archived, at least not in any sort of systematic way, and they're kind of expected to just be there and then be gone.
Yeah.
What does this mean for people in the future who want to know what life was like now and what it sounded like and looked like?
I'm so glad you asked, because this is kind of the focus of some of my dissertation. I was interested in comparing these two things because here are these two digital objects, right? The archive file that's maybe analog at first, but you make the digital file and you put it on the internet maybe, or you put it in a file folder in some server that you have to go to, or you have this digitally native object that's moving around and maybe 1 million people hear it. And that's kind of the lower limit for something being considered viral now, right? It used to be kind of a big deal. 1 million views, 1 billion views is a big deal now. But something that's spreading and spreading, and people are sharing it in this way where it has exponential growth, right? Like 100 people see it one day and 1,000 people the next and 10,000 the next. And it's working in this kind of wave where it's everywhere for a moment and then it's overexposed and then people are sick of it and then it's over. And this kind of hyperacceleration is also something that we've seen speed up over the years. So if you think back to early memes, they would last for months and years. And now a week, 2 weeks, then there's too much of it, then it's over. And there are some places that are doing work to document these phenomena, but a lot of it is like it's everywhere and then it's nowhere. It doesn't get saved. And that really stresses me out. It stresses me out from a perspective of we should be saving things. And it stresses me out because they're operating on this coin flip side of each other, where one is really replicating an in-person structure of this sort of library, Dewey Decimal type file card system. You put it on a computer, but it's not different from how it was in person. And you have to know how to search and how to find what you're looking for. And you can't touch it, right? It has to maintain this sort of pristine condition, and it's getting saved in 2 places versus this thing that's maybe not getting saved anywhere but is reliant on a collective memory and that has all of these different participants actively working to change and morph and shift it but that's then forgotten as soon as it happened. So where these two things meet, I think there's something really relevant about them meeting in this space where they're both trying to achieve the same goal, which is embed themselves in some sort of institutional memory. And they both fall short in some ways, specifically in the digital space and the place that we live now. Either they're not getting saved in a systemic way, or they're getting saved but not distributed.
Yeah. There are a few archives that post things on social media or recordings on YouTube, and most don't. In Germany, you probably can't because of data and copyright protection laws. I think that contrast is really illuminating, that archives are preserving sounds, and yet most people can't access those sounds. And then on the other hand, you have the actual digital world that most people are accessing every day and hearing music and accessing dance on, which is completely ephemeral and not being preserved in memory institutions, so that at some point in the future, people will read about whatever meme was popular and have no way to actually view it or hear it.
Well, and we've chosen to outsource and trust a lot of third-party hosting platforms, and they have a sense of permanence, but it's not a true permanence. So YouTube is still existing, and that's great. Old YouTube videos still exist, although they have started to purge accounts that are inactive. So some of the older videos have a life that is temporary, or even something like a copyright flag. There are all types of ways that this stuff can get damaged or go away. And also these platforms are ephemeral. Things like Facebook and Instagram and the TikTok ban is a great example of this. If you're interested in doing this sort of media studies work, it involves doing a lot of screenshots and saving and hoping things don't go away. But it's really the sort of snapshot documentation. Internet Archive is really great, obviously. But at the end of the day, even that isn't saving videos and music. So what you're linking to is text around a sort of hole that shows where the thing used to be. It is a little scary, the sort of reliance that we have on these big tech giants that don't have to do things like save our photos forever. And this is something that also I've experienced in a very mild way, in the sense that my friend, will delete their Facebook because they don't want to be ruled by said corporate overlord. And then all of the photos that we had together from 2010 are just gone forever. This lack of a kind of hard copy, or this lack of a non-digital copy, is something that really scares me for future anthropologists. They might know some things, but I think they'll have a really different idea of what things were like, because there's all of this very ephemeral material that is really foundational to our day-to-day lives.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and sound archives that seem very removed from everyday life actually do have this kind of connection to our everyday life that maybe we need to think about more. But in terms of wrapping our conversation up today, I wonder if you could comment on what you hope your work is going to contribute to the field of archive research and its future directions.
I hope that I can make an argument that is about the ways that we should think about accessibility and opening things up. I also hope that I can encourage people to save their own things in a way that isn't reliant on these outside structures if they can. Something I feel like I changed in my own life after working with paper archives is just, you shouldn't store things in a basement and you shouldn't use rubber bands. And if you've seen somebody who did both those things, you know why.
Words of wisdom. Well, thank you, Hannah. But before we say goodbye, is there anything else you'd like to add that we didn't cover about sound archives, your work, or your time in Berlin?
No, I think this is great. I just want to say thank you so much, and also to thank you, because you were such a big part of my time in Berlin, and you've made it so great.
It's been a true pleasure.
Playing the Archive is part of the Second World Music Project, led by Dr. Sydney Hutchinson and housed at the Institute for Musicology and Media Studies at Humboldt University, Berlin. The project is funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and the podcast is produced with the support of the Media Department of Berlin's Ethnological Museum and Museum for Asian Art. All the sounds and music you heard in the episode were provided courtesy of Hannah Judd. That's all for now, but not forever. Thanks for joining us.